The last entry in Park Ranger David Moreau's logbook reads simply, "Something is wrong here. The woods are too quiet. Even the birds have stopped singing." His handwriting looks shaky and rushed. It's not like his usual neat writing. The date stamp shows the 15th of October, 2019. 3 days later, Moreau was found walking along Highway 61 near Grand Portage. He was barefoot and talking to himself. When state troopers came near him, he kept saying the same thing over and over. "It's still hungry. It's always hungry." Minnesota's huge wilderness has hidden dark secrets for hundreds of years. The state has 54 million acres of thick forest, clear lakes, and frozen land. Most of these remote areas have never been touched by modern life. But under the natural beauty lies something much more scary. Local tribes have whispered about it for many generations. Early settlers wrote fearful letters to family back east. They wrote about meeting creatures that made no sense. Today, park rangers, hunters, and hikers still report things that challenge everything we know about the natural world. The Wendigo has hunted Minnesota's forests long before white settlers came. The Ojibwe people knew it by many names: Wendigo, Witico, Wintico, all different ways of saying the same terrible word. It means cannibal, or the evil that eats. The tribe believed the Wendigo was once human. A person who ate human flesh during times of great hunger would change into something not human, something that could never fill its endless need for flesh. These weren't just scary stories. They were survival rules passed down through many generations. The Ojibwe said the Wendigo was a thin giant. It stood 15 feet tall with yellow fangs and sunken eyes. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over sticking out bones. Pieces of flesh would hang in torn strips. This showed the dark muscle and tissue underneath. Most scary of all was its heart. The Ojibwe said it was made of ice that could never melt. French traders and church workers heard these stories as early as 1636. Many thought they were just simple superstitions. Others weren't so sure. Father Gabriel Lalemant wrote in his journal about meeting Ojibwe hunters. They would not enter certain parts of the forest. This was true even during harsh winters when game was hard to find. They spoke of places where the very air felt different, colder, where tracks would appear in the snow overnight. The tracks were too large to belong to any known animal. The first written European encounter happened in 1661. Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac was an explorer. He founded Detroit. He was leading a small group through what is now northern Minnesota. His party had been traveling for 3 weeks through harsh land. Food was running low, winter was coming fast. On the night of the 3rd of October, something began walking around their camp. Cadillac's journal talks about hearing footsteps in the darkness beyond their fire. Heavy, careful steps that seemed to come from something much larger than a bear or moose. The native guides with them became more and more upset. They spoke in quiet voices about evil spirits and cursed ground. When morning came, they found tracks in the soft earth around their campsite. The prints looked roughly human but were almost 18 inches long. Even more scary, they seemed to show only 4 toes on each foot. Each toe ended in what looked like claws. The party broke camp right away. They pushed south as fast as their supplies would let them. But whatever had visited them during the night wasn't done. For the next 4 days, they would wake to find their camp surrounded by the same huge tracks. On the 5th morning, one of their horses was found dead. Its chest was torn open, and the organs were removed with perfect cuts. The remaining meat had been left alone. It was as if whatever killed the animal had no interest in normal food. 2 members of the group said they saw a figure watching them from the tree line during the day. They said it was very tall and thin. It moved between the pine trees with smooth grace, despite its huge size. When they tried to point it out to others, the figure would disappear. Cadillac himself didn't believe them until the final night of their ordeal. He was woken by what he called the most terrible cry I have ever heard. He came out of his tent to find something standing at the edge of their camp. His account is kept in the Detroit Historical Society files. It has remarkable detail for its time. The creature stood nearly twice the height of a man. Its arms hung down past its knees. Its face looked like a skull with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like a night animal. Most scary was its smile. Cadillac wrote that it seemed to be grinning at him. It showed rows of yellow teeth filed to sharp points. The two stared at each other across the dying campfire for what felt like hours. Then the creature raised one long finger to its lips. It was telling him to be quiet. Then it melted back into the forest. Cadillac's party reached safety 3 days later, but he never spoke about the encounter in public. His journal was sealed and forgotten until historians found it in 1987. As white settlers pushed deeper into Minnesota's wilderness, reports of Wendigo encounters began appearing often. The local newspaper, the Minnesota Pioneer, wrote about several cases between 1845 and 1855. Most followed the same pattern. Hunters or trappers would go into remote areas. They would return with stories of being stalked by something not natural. Many left their traps behind. They refused to return to good hunting grounds. The case of Jacob Morrison became well known among the frontier communities. Morrison was a fur trapper from Duluth. He had been working the same trap line for 5 seasons without problems. The route took him through a section of forest near what is now the Boundary Waters canoe area. Local Ojibwe had warned him that the area was cursed, but Morrison needed the money to support his growing family. During the winter of 1851, Morrison's behavior began to change badly. His wife Sarah later told investigators that he would return from trapping trips very upset. He complained of being followed through the forest. He said that something was stealing animals from his traps, not eating them, but taking them away completely. It left behind only traces of blood in the snow. Morrison talked about finding his traps triggered but empty. Huge tracks led away into the deeper woods. He began carrying his rifle everywhere. He boarded up the windows of their cabin at night. Sarah said that he would often wake up screaming. He claimed that something was trying to get inside. When she looked out the windows, she sometimes saw a tall figure standing among the trees. It stayed just beyond the reach of their lanterns. The situation got much worse. In February 1852, Morrison had been checking his traps for 3 days without finding a single animal. On the afternoon of the 14th of February, he found out why. Every trap on his line had been triggered and destroyed. They weren't damaged by struggling animals. They had been taken apart on purpose. Wooden stakes had been pulled from the frozen ground and snapped in half. Metal parts were twisted into impossible shapes. It was as if something with huge strength had taken them apart piece by piece. As Morrison gathered the remains of his equipment, he became aware that he was being watched. Standing about 50 yards away was the tallest human figure he had ever seen. It was partly hidden by a group of birch trees. Morrison first thought it might be a native hunter, but as his eyes got used to the light, he realized this was something else. The figure stood completely still. Its arms hung at its sides like a scarecrow. Its head was tilted at a wrong angle. It seemed to be studying Morrison like a predator. Most scary was that it seemed to have no clothes despite the very cold temperature. Its skin was pale gray. It almost matched the color of the birch bark behind it. Morrison later told authorities that he couldn't tell exactly when the figure began moving toward him. It didn't walk so much as glide between the trees. It covered ground very fast. Panicking, Morrison fired his rifle right at the approaching figure. The shot echoed through the forest. When the sound faded, the creature was gone. Morrison ran all the way back to his cabin. It was nearly 3 miles through deep snow. When he got there, he found his wife waiting by the door. She had heard the gunshot and feared the worst. But Morrison's trouble wasn't over. As he told his story to Sarah, they became aware of sounds outside their cabin. Heavy footsteps walking around the building. There was also what Sarah later called a low humming noise. It was almost like singing. The couple spent the night together, listening as something carefully tested every door and window. Morrison's cabin was built well. It had thick log walls and heavy wooden shutters. But whatever was outside seemed determined to find a way in. Around midnight, the sounds stopped. When Morrison finally got the courage to look through a crack in the shutters, he saw tracks in the snow. They went completely around their home. The next morning, Morrison packed up his family and moved to Street Paul. He never returned to the woods. He refused to talk about what happened with anyone except his closest friends. His empty cabin was found by another trapper the following spring. The building had been torn apart from the outside. Huge claw marks were cut deep into the log walls. The Morrison case got the attention of territorial authorities. They started a small investigation. Deputy Marshal Thomas Hendricks talked to several witnesses. He looked at the remains of the cabin. His report was filed with the territorial government in 1852. It said the damage was consistent with an attack by a very large bear. However, Hendricks' personal notes tell a different story. These were found in the Minnesota Historical Society files. According to these private documents, Hendricks found evidence that troubled him greatly. The claw marks on Morrison's cabin were too regular and too deep. They couldn't have been made by any known animal. Even more scary were the tracks he found around the building. Like those described by Cadillac 200 years earlier, they looked roughly human but were far too large. Hendricks measured several clear prints. He found them to be over 17 inches long. The deputy marshal also talked to local Ojibwe leaders. This included Chief Little Wolf of the Mille Lacs Band. The chief didn't want to discuss the matter with white authorities at first, but he finally shared scary details about the area where Morrison had been trapping. According to tribal stories, that section of forest had been avoided for generations. It was considered a place where the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds was thin. Chief Little Wolf told Hendricks about a tragedy that had happened in that area during the harsh winter of 1823. A hunting party had become lost during a severe blizzard. They were forced to seek shelter for several weeks. When they failed to return, a rescue party was sent to find them. The searchers found a horrible scene. The hunters had apparently turned to eating human flesh to survive. Their remains showed signs of ritual violence. According to the chief, the area had been cursed ever since. Hunters who went there reported being followed by something that copied human behavior, but was clearly not human. Animals avoided the region completely. Even experienced guides refused to travel through it alone. Chief Little Wolf warned Hendricks that Morrison had been lucky to escape with his life. The deputy marshal filed his official report. He recommended that the area be declared off-limits to white settlers, but his suggestions were ignored. The territorial government was more interested in encouraging people to move west than investigating native superstitions. Hendricks' private notes show his frustration with this decision. He continued to investigate Wendigo reports throughout his career. He built a large file of witness stories that was never made public. As Minnesota became a state in 1858, reports of Wendigo encounters began to decrease. Many thought this was because of the growing population. Wildlife was retreating into more remote areas. But those familiar with the creature suspected a different explanation. The creature hadn't disappeared. It had simply become more careful about showing itself. The logging boom of the late 1800s brought thousands of workers into Minnesota's deepest forests. Lumber camps operated year-round in areas that had never seen permanent human homes. Most of these men were tough, practical people. They had little patience for ghost stories, but even the most doubting loggers began to report strange things in certain areas. The camp at Vermilion Lake was run by the Minnesota Timber Company. It had a series of incidents that confused management and terrified workers. The troubles began in September 1889. Several loggers reported finding their equipment moved during the night. Saws would be found hanging from tree branches. Axes would be found driven deep into stumps. It was as if someone with huge strength had been testing how sharp they were. Camp foreman Patrick O'Sullivan first thought it was practical jokes or theft by competing companies. He posted guards and made a buddy system for workers traveling between the camp and their cutting areas. These safety measures seemed to help for a few weeks. But in early October, the situation got much worse. 3 loggers named Anders Peterson, Mikko Salonen, and Giuseppe Rossi were working a section of forest about 2 miles from the main camp. The men were experienced woodcutters. They had worked together for several seasons. Around mid-morning, Peterson began to feel like they were being watched. He mentioned this to his partners. They laughed off his concerns at first. By noon, all 3 men were aware of a presence in the forest around them. They could hear footsteps that seemed to copy their own movements. When they stopped working, the sounds would also stop. When they started cutting again, the mysterious footsteps would continue. Salonen was the most experienced of the 3. He suggested they return to camp early. Something felt wrong about the forest that day. As they gathered their tools and got ready to leave, Peterson spotted movement out of the corner of his eye. Standing about 30 yards away was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was partly hidden behind a huge pine tree. It looked human but stretched to impossible size. Its arms hung down almost to the ground. Its head seemed too small for its long body. Peterson called out to his partners, but when they looked in the direction he was pointing, the figure was gone. Rossi suggested they might have seen a bear standing on its back legs, but Peterson was certain of what he had seen. The 3 men quickly packed their equipment. They began the walk back to camp. About halfway along the trail, they realized they were being followed. The sounds of pursuit were no longer subtle. Something large was moving through the forest behind them. It made no effort to hide its presence. Branches snapped loudly as it pushed through the plants. The footsteps were heavy and careful. They matched their pace exactly. Salonen had served in the Finnish military before coming to America. He took charge of the situation. He ordered his partners to drop their heavy equipment and move as quickly as possible toward camp. The 3 men broke into a run, but their pursuer kept pace easily. Whatever was following them seemed to be playing with them. It stayed just out of sight while making its presence very clear. The men burst into camp shouting for help. They claimed they were being chased by some kind of wild animal. Foreman O'Sullivan put together a search party. He returned to the area with 6 armed men. They found the abandoned tools exactly where the loggers had dropped them, but there was no sign of any animal. The search party did find tracks in the soft earth near the trail. Like those found at previous Wendigo encounter sites, they looked roughly human but were far too large to have been made by any person. O'Sullivan was a practical man. He had spent most of his adult life working in the woods. He had dealt with bears, wolves, and even the occasional mountain lion. But these tracks bothered him in a way he couldn't quite explain. They seemed almost human, yet the stride length suggested something much taller than any person he had ever met. The logging company brought in a professional tracker named Samuel Waterman. He was hired to investigate the problems. Waterman was a former military scout. He had worked throughout the upper Midwest, tracking everything from deserters to escaped convicts. His reputation for finding both people and animals was well known among law enforcement agencies. Waterman spent 3 days looking at the area around Vermilion Lake. His findings were scary and confusing. The tracks were definitely not made by any known wildlife. The impressions were too deep and too regular to be hoaxes or natural formations. Most puzzling was their apparent age. Some tracks appeared fresh. Others seemed to have been made weeks or even months earlier. The tracker also found something that hadn't been mentioned in previous reports. Near several of the clearest track impressions, he found what appeared to be bite marks on nearby trees. The marks were roughly 7 feet off the ground. They showed a tooth pattern unlike any animal in his experience. The impressions were too large for wolves or bears, yet they were too organized to be random damage. Waterman talked to all the workers who had reported encounters. He paid particular attention to details that might identify the creature responsible. He noticed several consistent elements in their stories. All witnesses described something much larger than human size. Most mentioned a wrong way of moving. It was as if the creature's joints didn't work the same way as normal limbs. Several reported a strong smell, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur. Most scary was a detail that several witnesses mentioned, but seemed reluctant to discuss. They said the creature appeared to be smiling at them, not the expression of a happy human being, but the grimace of something pretending to understand human emotion. This detail troubled Waterman more than any physical evidence he had found. The tracker submitted his report to Minnesota Timber Company management in November 1889. His official conclusions were carefully worded. He didn't want to seem superstitious or unprofessional. He recommended that the company consider moving operations to a different area. He cited unknown predator activity and potential worker safety issues. Privately, Waterman told friends that he believed something genuinely dangerous was living in the forests around Vermilion Lake. He had found evidence of intelligence and planning that went far beyond normal animal behavior. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be studying human activities. It was changing its own behavior accordingly. The Minnesota Timber Company chose to ignore Waterman's recommendations. Logging operations continued at Vermilion Lake through the winter, but worker morale remained poor. Several experienced loggers quit and moved to other camps. They cited personal reasons. Those who remained were jumpy. They tended to work in larger groups than normal. The situation came to a head in January 1890. A logger named Hugh MacDonald was found dead in his bunk on the morning of the 18th of January. The camp doctor determined that MacDonald had died of heart failure, but the circumstances surrounding his death raised troubling questions. MacDonald had been in good health and was only 32 years old. He had no history of heart problems. He was considered one of the strongest men in the camp. On the night of his death, several workers reported hearing him talking to someone in his bunk, but MacDonald slept alone in a corner section of the bunkhouse. The most scary detail came out during the doctor's examination. MacDonald's body showed signs of extreme stress. It was as if he had been terrified beyond endurance. His fingernails were bloody from clawing at his blankets. His eyes were wide open in an expression of absolute horror. Workers who had been sleeping nearby reported hearing MacDonald's side of what sounded like a conversation. He had been speaking in urgent whispers. He seemed to be trying to convince someone to go away. Several men recalled hearing him say, "Please, I never did anything," and "I'm not the one you want." The incident effectively ended large-scale logging operations at Vermilion Lake. Within 2 months, Minnesota Timber Company had moved their entire operation to a site near Hibbing. Official records cite operational difficulties as the reason for the move. But former workers told a different story. The camp had become unlivable due to what they described as supernatural harassment. The abandoned logging camp at Vermilion Lake quickly gained a reputation among local residents. Hunters and fishermen reported strange happenings in the area throughout the 1890s. Equipment would disappear overnight. Cabins would be found with huge claw marks on the walls. Most scary were the sightings of a tall figure. It would watch people from the forest edge, but vanish if anyone tried to approach. By the turn of the 20th century, Wendigo encounters had become part of Minnesota folklore. Local newspapers occasionally reported sightings. They usually dismissed them as cases of mistaken identity or overactive imagination, but law enforcement agencies quietly continued to investigate reports that couldn't be easily explained away. The case files of Sheriff Robert Erickson of Cook County provide insight into official attitudes toward Wendigo reports during this period. Erickson served as sheriff from 1903 to 1921. He was known for his methodical approach to unusual cases. His private files were donated to the Minnesota Historical Society by his family in 1967. They contain detailed investigations of 17 separate Wendigo encounters. Erickson's approach was refreshingly scientific for its time. Rather than dismissing reports outright, He treated them as legitimate police matters requiring careful investigation. He talked to witnesses extensively. He examined physical evidence. He consulted with experts ranging from university professors to tribal elders. One of Eriksson's most thoroughly documented cases involved the disappearance of two hunters. They were named Carl Johnson and Peter Nordstrom. They disappeared in October 1908. The men had gone deer hunting in the Superior National Forest. They failed to return when expected. Eriksson organized a search party. They located the abandoned camp near Basswood Lake. The scene that greeted the searchers was deeply scary. The hunter's tent had been torn open from the outside. It had long gashes that appeared to have been made by claws. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the campsite, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Most puzzling was the condition of their rifles. They were found broken into pieces and scattered over a wide area. Eriksson's investigation revealed several troubling details. The hunters' boots were found nearly a quarter-mile from their camp. They were placed neatly side by side on a fallen log. Their clothing was discovered hanging from tree branches. It was torn but not destroyed. Most scary were the huge tracks found throughout the area. They were similar to those reported in earlier Wendigo encounters. The sheriff brought in tracking dogs, but the animals refused to follow the scent trails. The dogs became upset and fearful when brought near the campsite. They whimpered and tried to retreat despite their handlers' encouragement. This behavior was highly unusual for experienced hunting dogs. They were used to tracking wounded game through difficult terrain. Johnson and Nordstrom were never found. The search effort lasted 3 weeks. Eriksson continued to investigate the case for months afterward. He talked to local guides. He consulted with Ojibwe leaders about similar disappearances. His files suggest that he came to believe something genuinely dangerous was responsible for the men's disappearance. The sheriff's investigation led him to similar cases dating back several decades. He discovered that hunters and trappers had been vanishing in the Superior National Forest area with scary regularity. Many of these disappearances had never been officially reported. Either the missing persons had no family to notify authorities, or local residents preferred to handle such matters privately. Eriksson compiled a list of 18 confirmed disappearances between 1885 and 1910. All followed similar patterns. The missing persons were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the area well. Their camps would be found destroyed but not looted. Personal belongings would be scattered or arranged in strange patterns. Tracking dogs would refuse to follow scent trails. Search parties would report feeling watched while conducting their investigations. Most scary was a pattern that Eriksson noticed in survivor accounts. Several people who had encountered something unusual in the forest reported that it seemed to be copying human behavior. It would follow at a distance, matching their movements exactly. Some witnesses claimed it would even attempt to copy their voice. It would call out to companions in distorted copies of familiar voices. This detail appeared in multiple independent reports spanning several decades. Eriksson found it particularly troubling because it suggested a level of intelligence far beyond what any known predator possessed. The creature wasn't just hunting, it was studying its prey. It was learning their habits and trying to control their behavior. The sheriff's files also contain letters with colleagues in neighboring counties. They were dealing with similar reports. It became clear that Wendigo encounters were not limited to Cook County or even to Minnesota. Law enforcement agencies throughout the upper Midwest were quietly investigating cases that followed remarkably similar patterns. Eriksson retired in 1921 without ever solving the mystery of the forest disappearances. His successor was Sheriff William Anderson. He took a markedly different approach to such reports. Anderson was a practical man. He had little patience for what he considered superstitious nonsense. Under his leadership, Cook County stopped investigating Wendigo reports. They would only investigate if there was clear evidence of criminal activity. This policy change coincided with a general decline in Wendigo reports throughout Minnesota. Some attributed this to increased development. Wildlife was retreating into more remote areas. Others suspected that people simply stopped reporting encounters to authorities. The authorities were unlikely to take them seriously. But the Wendigo hadn't disappeared. It had simply adapted to changing circumstances. It became more elusive and selective about revealing itself. Reports continued to surface among hunters, hikers, and park workers. But these accounts were shared quietly within small communities. They were not reported to official agencies. The modern era of Wendigo encounters began in the 1970s. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness was established. This million-acre preserve encompasses some of Minnesota's most remote and pristine forest land. The area attracts thousands of visitors each year. They range from experienced wilderness guides to casual day hikers. Park Service records from this period show a steady stream of unusual incident reports. Most are filed under generic categories like wildlife encounter or lost camper. But reading between the lines reveals accounts that fit the classic Wendigo pattern. Visitors report being followed by something that stays just out of sight. Equipment disappears from secured campsites. Experienced outdoorsmen become disoriented in familiar territory. The case of wilderness guide Tom Brennan shows how Wendigo encounters have evolved in the modern era. Brennan had been leading canoe trips into the Boundary Waters for over 15 years. Then he experienced something that changed his understanding of the wilderness. He thought he knew it so well. In August 1987, Brennan was guiding a group of 6 clients on a week-long camping trip. They were going through the most remote sections of the preserve. The group included 2 married couples from Minneapolis and a father-son team from Chicago. All were experienced outdoor enthusiasts. They had specifically requested a challenging wilderness experience. On the 3rd day of their trip, the group made camp on a small island in the middle of Knife Lake. The location was ideal. It provided excellent fishing and protection from wind and weather. Brennan had used this campsite dozens of times without incident. But as evening approached, he began to notice subtle signs that something was different. The usual sounds of wildlife were noticeably absent. No loons called across the water. No owls hooted from the surrounding forest. Even the constant buzz of insects seemed muted. Brennan mentioned this to his clients. He explained that animals sometimes went quiet before storms, but the weather forecast had called for clear skies. As the group settled around their campfire, Brennan noticed movement on the mainland shore about 200 yards away. At first, he assumed it was a moose or deer coming to drink at the water's edge. But as he watched through binoculars, he realized he was looking at something that stood upright like a human, but it was far too tall to be a person. The figure remained perfectly still for several minutes. It seemed to be studying their campsite. Brennan estimated its height at well over 7 feet. It had disproportionately long arms that hung almost to the ground. Most scary was its apparent lack of clothing, despite the cool evening temperature. Brennan quietly alerted his clients to the presence of what he described as a large animal on the distant shore. Several members of the group took turns looking through the binoculars, but opinions differed on what they were seeing. Some thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. Others were convinced they were looking at an unusually tall person. The figure remained in position until well after dark. It occasionally shifted its stance but never moved from its observation point. Brennan had guided hundreds of wilderness trips. He had encountered virtually every type of wildlife native to Minnesota. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for something that would stand motionless for hours. It seemed to be studying human activities. The group spent an uneasy night. They took turns keeping watch while others tried to sleep. Around 3 a.m., the figure finally disappeared from the shoreline. But instead of providing relief, its absence seemed to increase the sense of unease that had settled over the camp. Morning brought new concerns. When Brennan and his clients woke up, they discovered that several items had gone missing during the night. A camp stove had vanished from the cooking area. 2 paddles were gone from where they had been secured near the water's edge. Most puzzling was the disappearance of a heavy aluminum cooler. It had been tied to a tree to prevent bears from accessing the food inside. The missing equipment was discovered later that morning on the mainland shore. It was arranged in a neat line about 20 feet back from the water. Nothing had been damaged or consumed. The cooler was still locked. The food inside was undisturbed. It appeared that someone or something had simply moved their belongings across 200 yards of open water. Then they placed them carefully on dry land. Brennan was baffled by the incident. He had dealt with bear problems before, but bears didn't arrange stolen items in orderly rows. They certainly didn't transport heavy coolers across open water without leaving obvious signs of their passage. The aluminum cooler showed no tooth marks, claw scratches, or other evidence of animal handling. The group retrieved their equipment and continued their planned itinerary. But the atmosphere of their trip had fundamentally changed. What had started as a relaxing wilderness adventure had become a tense journey through territory that no longer felt safe or predictable. On their final night in the wilderness, Brennan was awakened by sounds outside his tent. Someone was walking around their campsite. They moved with deliberate steps that suggested familiarity with the area. Assuming one of his clients was answering a call of nature, he listened without concern initially. But as the minutes passed, Brennan realized that the footsteps were following a pattern. The walker was circling the camp in a clockwise direction. They maintained a consistent distance from the tents. Each circuit took exactly the same amount of time. It was as if whoever was walking had counted their steps. They were repeating the same route precisely. After listening to 3 complete circuits, Brennan became concerned enough to investigate. He quietly unzipped his tent and peered outside. He expected to find one of his clients sleepwalking or perhaps dealing with stomach problems. Instead, he saw a tall figure moving between the trees at the edge of their campsite. The figure was roughly human in shape, but moved with an unnatural gait. This suggested its limbs were longer than they should be. It appeared to be studying their camp layout. It paused at each tent, as if taking inventory of the occupants inside. Most scary was its apparent indifference to being observed. When Brennan emerged from his tent, the figure turned to look at him directly, but it made no effort to flee or hide. For several seconds, guide and creature regarded each other across the dying campfire. Brennan later described feeling as if he was being evaluated by something with intelligence far beyond any wildlife he had encountered. The figure's posture suggested curiosity rather than aggression, but there was something deeply wrong about the way it held itself. Then, without warning, the figure raised one long arm and waved at Brennan. It was a grotesque parody of human greeting. The gesture was technically correct but performed with mechanical precision. This made it seem more threatening than friendly. Brennan waved back instinctively. The figure immediately copied his movement exactly. This interaction continued for several minutes. The creature copied every gesture Brennan made. When he raised both arms above his head, it did the same. When he took a step forward, it moved forward. When he retreated toward his tent, it retreated toward the trees. The mimicry was perfect, but somehow fundamentally wrong. It was as if something was practicing human behavior without truly understanding its meaning. Eventually, Brennan returned to his tent and zipped it closed. He hoped the creature would lose interest and move on. He could hear it continue circling the camp for another hour before the footsteps finally faded into the distance. The next morning, Brennan discovered that the creature had left behind evidence of its visit. Huge tracks circled their entire campsite. They were pressed deep into the soft earth near the water's edge. The prints were roughly human in shape, but nearly 18 inches long. They appeared to have claw marks at the toe end. More scary was a pattern of broken branches that surrounded their camp. Trees and saplings had been snapped at a height of roughly 8 feet. This created a crude circle around their sleeping area. The breaks were clean and appeared to have been made by something with enormous strength. Yet the damaged vegetation had been arranged with almost artistic precision. Brennan photographed the evidence before leading his group out of the wilderness. He reported the incident to Park Service authorities but received little official response. his photos were filed away. He was told that the tracks were probably made by an unusually large bear. But Brennan knew what he had seen wasn't a bear. He had guided wilderness trips for 15 years. He had encountered black bears on numerous occasions. Bears didn't walk upright for extended periods. They didn't arrange broken branches in decorative patterns. Most importantly, they didn't wave at humans or attempt to copy human gestures. The experience fundamentally changed Brennan's relationship with the wilderness. He continued working as a guide for several more years, but he never again felt completely comfortable in the remote areas where he had spent most of his adult life. He began carrying a rifle on trips where firearms had never seemed necessary before. More significantly, he started avoiding certain areas of the boundary waters entirely. This was particularly true near Knife Lake, where his encounter had occurred. Brennan's report joined dozens of similar accounts in Park Service files. A pattern was emerging that troubled wildlife biologists and law enforcement officers familiar with the area. Visitors were reporting encounters with something that displayed characteristics of advanced intelligence but clearly wasn't human. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service. She began compiling these reports in 1992. This was part of her research into predator-human interactions in wilderness areas. Her database eventually included over 200 documented encounters spanning 3 decades. While she couldn't explain what people were seeing, she was convinced that the reports deserved serious scientific investigation. Martinez's research revealed several consistent patterns in modern Wendigo encounters. The creature appeared to be primarily active during late autumn and winter months. It showed a marked preference for remote areas with minimal human traffic. Most significantly, it demonstrated behavior that suggested it was actively studying human activities rather than simply hunting for food. Unlike traditional predators, the Wendigo seemed more interested in observing humans than attacking them. The vast majority of encounters ended with the creature withdrawing when it realized it had been detected. This suggested either unusual intelligence or an agenda that didn't involve immediate predation. Martinez theorized that the reports might describe an unknown primate species. Such a creature had adapted to Minnesota's harsh climate. It would need to be highly intelligent to survive in an environment that challenged even experienced human outdoorsmen. The mimicry behavior, reported by many witnesses, could represent an attempt to understand potential threats or competitors in its territory. But this theory failed to explain several troubling aspects of Wendigo encounters. No primate species was known to reach the size described by witnesses. More problematically, no one had ever found physical remains of such a creature. This was despite decades of reported sightings in a relatively small geographic area. The mystery deepened in 2003 when trail cameras began capturing images that couldn't be easily explained. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources had installed motion-activated cameras throughout the Superior National Forest. They wanted to monitor wildlife populations. While most photos showed expected species like deer, bears, and wolves, a small percentage captured something else entirely. The images were typically blurry and unclear. They showed tall figures that moved through the forest with unusual gaits. Most were dismissed as photographic artifacts or cases of mistaken identity, but a few images were clear enough to raise serious questions about what was living in Minnesota's deepest wilderness. One photograph was taken near Gunflint Lake in November 2003. It showed a figure standing upright between 2 large pine trees. The creature appeared to be over 8 feet tall. It had disproportionately long limbs and a gaunt body structure. Most scary was its apparent awareness of the camera. The figure seemed to be looking directly at the lens. It was as if it understood it was being photographed. Wildlife photographer Marcus Webb was hired by the Department of Natural Resources. He was asked to investigate the unusual trail camera images. Webb had spent 20 years documenting wildlife throughout North America. He was considered an expert in identifying unusual species. His analysis of the Gunflint Lake photograph was sobering. According to Webb's technical report, The image showed genuine depth and perspective. This ruled out obvious hoaxes like cardboard cutouts or photographic manipulation. The figure's proportions were consistent with a living creature, but they didn't match any known North American wildlife. Most puzzling was the creature's posture. It suggested bipedal locomotion despite its enormous size. Webb spent 6 months investigating trail camera sites throughout the Superior National Forest. He talked to park rangers, he reviewed maintenance logs, he personally examined cameras that had captured unusual images. His findings suggested that something large and intelligent was deliberately avoiding human detection. At the same time, it was moving through the wilderness. Several cameras showed evidence of being deliberately repositioned. It was as if something had discovered them and moved them to different angles. Others had been covered with vegetation or mud. This prevented them from capturing clear images. Most telling were cameras that had been completely destroyed. They were torn from their mounting posts and scattered in pieces across the forest floor. The pattern of camera interference suggested systematic behavior rather than random animal activity. Whatever was responsible seemed to understand the purpose of the devices. It was taking deliberate steps to avoid documentation. This level of technological awareness was unprecedented in Webb's experience with wildlife photography. His final report concluded that an unknown species was likely responsible for the trail camera anomalies. Webb recommended expanded monitoring efforts. He suggested that the creature might represent a relict population of an undiscovered primate species. His recommendations were quietly filed away. Funding for additional research was denied. The official stance on Wendigo reports remained skeptical throughout the early 2000s, but this began to change following a series of incidents in 2007. The case that finally forced authorities to take Wendigo reports seriously involved the disappearance of experienced wilderness guide Rachel Morrison near the Canadian border. Morrison had been leading solo survival training courses in the Boundary Waters for over a decade. She was known for her exceptional woodcraft skills. She could navigate the most remote areas of the wilderness preserve. Her disappearance during a routine training exercise shocked the outdoor education community throughout the upper Midwest. Morrison had planned a 5-day solo survival course in an area near Basswood Lake. Her itinerary called for her to hike to a predetermined location. She would establish a base camp using only basic tools. Then she would demonstrate various wilderness survival techniques. She was scheduled to return on the 15th of September 2007, but she failed to appear at the designated pickup point. Search and rescue teams located Morrison's base camp on the 17th of September. The scene they discovered defied easy explanation. Morrison's tent had been torn apart from the outside. It had long gashes that appeared to have been made by claws. Her equipment was scattered throughout the campsite, but nothing appeared to have been stolen or consumed. Most puzzling was the condition of Morrison's survival shelter. She had constructed it using traditional wilderness techniques. The shelter had been systematically dismantled. Each component was placed in a neat pile, roughly 20 yards from the original construction site. The precision of the dismantling process suggested intelligence and planning rather than random destruction. Search teams found Morrison's boots placed carefully on a fallen log about 50 yards from her campsite. Her socks were discovered hanging from a tree branch nearby. They were clean and undamaged. This pattern of deliberately arranged personal belongings was becoming a signature element of Wendigo encounters. The search for Morrison continued for 3 weeks. It involved over 100 volunteers and multiple aircraft. Tracking dogs were brought in from several states, but they behaved strangely when brought to Morrison's campsite. The animals became agitated and fearful. They refused to follow scent trails despite the presence of clear human tracks in the surrounding area. On the 3rd of October, 2007, Morrison was found alive but disoriented. She was about 15 miles from her original campsite. She was discovered by a fishing guide near Crooked Lake. She was wandering through the forest in her underwear despite near-freezing temperatures. Her physical condition suggested she had been surviving in the wilderness for the entire period of her disappearance, but she had no memory of how she had traveled such a great distance. Morrison's medical examination revealed several troubling details. Despite spending nearly 3 weeks in the wilderness during increasingly cold weather, she showed no signs of hypothermia or frostbite. Her body weight had actually increased during her disappearance. This suggested she had been eating regularly throughout the ordeal. Most scary were the psychological effects of her experience. Morrison had previously been known for her calm demeanor and exceptional wilderness skills. Now she was terrified of being alone outdoors. She reported having vivid nightmares about being followed through the forest. Something was copying her voice and movements. During psychiatric evaluation, Morrison recalled fragments of her missing time. She remembered being awakened during her first night in the wilderness by sounds outside her tent. Someone was walking around her campsite. But when she called out, the footsteps stopped immediately. When she emerged from her tent to investigate, she found huge tracks circling her camp. Morrison's clearest memory involved an encounter on what she believed was her second night in the wilderness. She woke to find a tall figure standing at the edge of her campsite. It was silhouetted against the moonlight. The figure appeared to be watching her tent with patient attention. It occasionally shifted its weight, but never moved from its position. According to Morrison, she lay still inside her tent for what felt like hours. She listened to the creature's breathing and hoped it would eventually leave. Instead, it began speaking to her in her own voice. The creature repeated phrases she had spoken earlier in the day, but the words were delivered with mechanical precision that made them sound alien and threatening. The voice copying continued throughout the night. The creature was apparently practicing different aspects of human speech. Morrison recalled hearing it repeat her name over and over. Each repetition was slightly different in tone or inflection. By morning, she was convinced she was dealing with something that was studying her behavior rather than simply hunting for food. Morrison's account ends abruptly after this encounter. She has no memory of the following 2.5 weeks. This is despite clear evidence that she continued to survive and even thrive in the wilderness during this period. Medical experts suggested that psychological trauma might explain her memory loss, but they couldn't account for her improved physical condition. The Morrison case attracted national attention. It prompted the first official investigation of Wendigo reports by federal authorities. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was quietly consulted about the possibility that a serial offender might be responsible for wilderness disappearances throughout the upper Midwest. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh led the federal investigation. She focused on patterns that might indicate human involvement in the disappearances. Her team examined over 50 cases dating back to the 1970s. They looked for evidence of organized criminal activity or individual predators operating in wilderness areas. Walsh's investigation revealed scary consistencies across multiple cases and several decades. The disappearances followed remarkably similar patterns. This was despite occurring in different locations and involving different types of outdoor enthusiasts. Missing persons were typically experienced outdoorsmen who knew the areas where they disappeared. More significantly, Walsh discovered that similar cases were being reported throughout forested regions of the northern United States and southern Canada. Law enforcement agencies in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ontario, and Quebec were quietly investigating disappearances. They matched the Minnesota pattern almost exactly. The federal investigation ultimately concluded that no human perpetrator could account for the scope and consistency of the wilderness disappearances. Walsh's final report was classified at the time, but later leaked to researchers. It suggested that an unknown factor was responsible for the incidents. The report stopped short of endorsing supernatural explanations, but it acknowledged that conventional law enforcement approaches had failed to solve the mystery. Following the Morrison case, official attitudes toward Wendigo reports began to change subtly. Park rangers received updated training on handling unusual wildlife encounters. Search and rescue protocols were modified. They now accounted for the possibility that missing persons might be dealing with non-traditional threats. Most significantly, several wilderness areas began posting advisory signs. They warned visitors about large predator activity in certain regions. While these signs didn't specifically mention the Wendigo, experienced outdoorsmen understood that something beyond normal wildlife was being acknowledged. The modern Wendigo appears to have adapted to increased human presence in Minnesota's wilderness areas. Rather than avoiding people entirely, it seems to have developed more sophisticated strategies for remaining undetected. At the same time, it continues to interact with human visitors. Recent encounters follow different patterns than historical reports. The creature now appears more likely to observe humans from a distance, rather than approaching camps or confronting people directly. Technology has forced it to become more cautious, but it continues to demonstrate the intelligence and adaptability that have allowed it to survive for centuries. Park rangers throughout northern Minnesota report incidents that fit the evolving Wendigo pattern. Equipment disappears from locked storage areas, surveillance cameras malfunction or are mysteriously repositioned. Experienced outdoor professionals become disoriented in familiar territory. Sometimes they find themselves miles from where they intended to be. They have no clear memory of how they traveled such distances. The creature's apparent fascination with copying human behavior has also evolved. Rather than simply copying voices or gestures, it now seems to be studying more complex aspects of human society. Cell phone towers in remote areas occasionally receive calls from numbers that don't exist. These feature recordings of human voices speaking in languages that linguists can't identify. Digital trail cameras sometimes capture images of symbols or patterns. These appear to have been deliberately created. These formations typically consist of broken branches, arranged stones, or scratched marks on tree bark. The symbols don't match any known human writing system, but they demonstrate consistent structure and organization. This suggests they represent some form of communication. Wildlife biologists studying these patterns have noted their increasing sophistication over time. Early symbols were simple geometric shapes, but more recent formations display complex mathematical relationships and apparent linguistic structure. This progression suggests that the Wendigo is continuing to learn about human culture. It may be attempting to develop its own form of written communication. The implications of this development are profound. If the Wendigo possesses the intelligence to create symbolic language, it represents a form of consciousness far beyond anything previously documented. Such capabilities would place it closer to human-level intelligence than to any known animal species. Dr. Elena Vasquez is a linguistic anthropologist at the University of Minnesota. She has spent 5 years studying the symbols found at Wendigo encounter sites. Her preliminary analysis suggests they represent a consistent symbolic system. It has grammatical rules and semantic meaning. If her conclusions are correct, humanity may be dealing with the first documented case of non-human intelligence developing written language. Vasquez's research has been conducted quietly. It doesn't have official university support or peer review. The academic community remains skeptical of Wendigo research. They view it as pseudoscience rather than legitimate scholarship. But Vasquez continues her work. She is driven by the conviction that the symbols represent a breakthrough in understanding non-human intelligence. Her database now includes over 300 documented symbol formations. They are found throughout Minnesota's wilderness areas. The symbols appear to be increasing in frequency and complexity. This suggests that the Wendigo's communication system is still evolving. Some formations appear near heavily traveled hiking trails. It is as if the creature is attempting to communicate with human visitors The most intriguing development in Vasquez's research involves apparent responses to human attempts at communication. She has experimented with creating her own symbol formations near known Wendigo activity sites. In several cases, her symbols have been modified or rearranged overnight. This suggests that the creature is actively engaging with her attempts at contact. These interactions remain tentative and limited, but they represent the first documented case of deliberate communication between humans and the Wendigo. Vasquez believes she may be witnessing the early stages of first contact with a non-human intelligence. It has been sharing Minnesota's wilderness with humans for centuries. The possibility of communicating with the Wendigo raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. If the creature possesses language capabilities and symbolic thinking, traditional assumptions about its primitive or bestial nature may be fundamentally incorrect. Humanity may need to reconsider its understanding of what intelligence looks like. It may need to consider how it might manifest in non-human forms. Meanwhile, Wendigo encounters continue throughout Minnesota's wilderness areas. Park rangers estimate that dozens of incidents occur each year. Most are never officially reported. The creature has become part of the landscape. It is a constant presence that outdoor enthusiasts learn to acknowledge without fully understanding. Some guides now include Wendigo safety information in their wilderness orientation programs. Campers are advised to secure their equipment carefully. They are told to avoid camping alone in certain areas. While these precautions are presented as general wildlife safety measures, experienced outdoorsmen understand their true purpose. The relationship between humans and the Wendigo appears to be entering a new phase. Rather than simple predator-prey interactions, the pattern now suggests a complex form of interspecies contact. The creature's apparent attempts at communication are combined with its sophisticated understanding of human technology and behavior. This indicates that it may be actively trying to establish some form of relationship with humanity. What this relationship might ultimately become remains unclear. The Wendigo's intentions are still largely mysterious. Its capacity for both intelligence and violence makes any interaction potentially dangerous, but the evidence suggests that ignoring its presence is no longer a viable strategy. Minnesota's forests continue to harbor secrets that challenge humanity's understanding of the natural world. The Wendigo represents a form of consciousness that doesn't fit neatly into existing scientific categories. It appears to be neither purely animal nor recognizably human, but it is something entirely different that has evolved alongside human civilization while remaining largely hidden from mainstream awareness. As more people venture into Minnesota's wilderness areas, encounters with this enigmatic creature are likely to increase. Whether these interactions will lead to greater understanding or more mysterious disappearances remains to be seen. The Wendigo has survived for centuries by adapting to changing conditions. Now, it faces its greatest challenge yet. It must learn how to coexist with a human population that is finally beginning to acknowledge its existence. The question is no longer whether something strange lives in Minnesota's forests. The evidence is too extensive and too consistent to dismiss. The question now is what humanity will do with this knowledge. It must decide whether it's prepared for whatever answers the Wendigo might provide. Park Ranger David Moreau eventually returned to active duty after extensive psychological evaluation. His logbook entries remain factual and professional, but colleagues report that he no longer patrols certain areas alone. When asked about his experience on Highway 61, he simply states that some questions are better left unasked. The forests of Minnesota keep their secrets well, but for those who know how to listen, the whispers continue. Something is watching from between the trees. It waits with the patience of centuries for humanity to finally understand what it's trying to say.